Hello, everybody. Okay, second try. We'll try this again. So, welcome to the McDowell kitchen. If you hear some noise out there, the gas company has been working on the pavement for the last couple weeks, so there's a bit of incidental noise. But I'm going to go ahead and I wanted to make a bit of a presentation today about something that was sort of timely for me. It has to do with let me see, bring my cursor over to this side of the page. An event that came to my attention through email, and it was a seminar that was connected to a person that I actually I know sort of incidentally, I gave a presentation for them sort of early on in the lockdowns. And so I ended up being on the email list for this organization called Insight Seminars. And so essentially it was a multi-part series that was and it was based here in Philadelphia, this organization. And it was looking at essentially like commoning and the commons, and but what drew my attention was that the individual who was presenting on the commons, he was actually identifies on his LinkedIn, Thaddeus Squire, as the founder and chief commons steward at Social Impact Commons. And I was like, oh, Social Impact Commons. And if you've been following along with some of the work that I've been doing in this descent map, I'm still in the descent map. We were looking at the ways in which sort of the greedy, crass, libertarian Bitcoin bros were being positioned, in my opinion, to segue into more like tokenized commoning, and that they would use the blockchain for, a new kind of, wonderful tool for collective impact. And they would, that they would pick up this idea of decentralized autonomous organizations and regenerative finance and decentralized finance, and sort of bring it under the purview of the public good. And that this was sort of being linked to something called cognitive capitalism, which is over here in the map. The idea that we share our knowledge and create this new kind of digital economy, and that we valorize social cooperation, although of course we need social proof that we're trustworthy content creators, so that all goes on the blockchain. And then as we move forward, there's this presumption that we might have some sort of, universal basic income payment, this common fare, a new kind of social currency. And so when I'm seeing social impact commons, a lot of this idea is built off of this sort of thought leader, Eleanor Ostrom here, who it was she was one of the few, or maybe if only, women to get the Nobel Prize in economics, or she was the first one to win the Nobel Prize in economics, and her focus was on sustainability and commoning. So a lot of these tokenized commoning programs sort of lean into Eleanor Ostrom's work. And so I'm just seeing this and going, oh, here it comes. And it's right here in Philadelphia too. And it just comes by way of your email inbox, which, I'm not here today to, make anybody wrong, but merely to sort of observe how this is showing up in my backyard. Again, so Thaddeus Squire was presenting earlier in the week on the long shadow of rentier capitalism, nonprofits, philanthropy, and how we turned a refuge into reformatory. And essentially what he's talking about is the third sector. In it, he talks about it having a $2.2 trillion in financial heft, and that maybe it hasn't always been good, but maybe, we need to fix it in this new version. And he's aware of the blockchain aspect because he's actually proposing this idea of fiscal sponsorship of third sector efforts being on decentralized autonomous organizations. So I saw this and I was like, I have to say something, because you see something, you say something. And the fact that this is social impact commoning in my city, I reached out to Thaddeus and I said, hey, would it be possible, do you know about this idea of pay for success finance? Do you know about this idea of social prescribing? and Internet of Bodies and sort of impact metrics. The stuff I talked about the last session, the Hong Kong Time Bank, and the idea that for the collective good that they would start to be tracking all of these informal social relations on blockchain. And I'll credit him. He did sort of reply, and he's like, no, I don't know. And I sent him a number of links. And so he said, well, here's my app. This is his, the tagline on his email. Thaddeus Squire, Chief Commons Steward on Church Road in Philadelphia. And it says to schedule a time to talk or meet, follow this link. And so I was like, okay, Thad, well, I'll follow the link, and we'll see about what we can talk about with tokenized commenting. And so we were supposed to meet actually today at 11. And so yesterday I emailed him just to reconfirm, and I said, hey, I set up this time for us to talk for like an hour on the app, and I'm assuming, I'm going to be coming out to you on Church Road, which is in the Overbrook neighborhood in Philadelphia, and I could see from Google Maps it's a very lovely building. It looks sort of like a big residential building, but that part of the city has these really big, had these really big homes that were built at the turn of the century. And I thought, well, maybe they have their office in a house. But actually what these new situations are is that people work remotely, right? You don't actually have an office anymore. And that wasn't an office building. That was just where he lives. And I think his colleague in the Social Impact Commons, her name is Astra Petkeviciute. She is the chief financial steward. And as far as I can tell, she's probably in Boston. So I'm thinking that the Social Impact Commons doesn't actually have its own office space unless maybe it's some sort of co-working space. And that wasn't specified on the app, like where you wanted to meet. And so when I reached out and I said, I'm not really interested in having this conversation on Zoom. So, I guess I'm going to cancel. And I was a bit snippy. Maybe I shouldn't have been so triggered, but I said something like, good luck feeding arts and culture, into the AI machine. Looks like you're doing a bang up job there, And then today I was tempted because in adding another bit of my map, it's this guy who's up with this Consilience project. Where is it? It's all the way up here. I was working on gaming and complexity theory, and I was adding Eugenio Battaglia, who is a Web3 designer in regenerative finance for Curve Labs, and also happens to be an expert in neuroscience and biotechnology and ethical global deliberation. So I was adding him in, and there was an article that he had liked on LinkedIn about how essentially your brain synchrony gets attenuated by doing Zoom communications. And so I was tempted to send this to him. This is the paper that came out in Neuroimaging. Technologically assisted communications attenuates interbrain synchrony, which is essentially sort of saying that, Zoom calls really, they don't do it. You really need some sort of live face-to-face connection to people to actually get some real social connection. And so, to me, there's sort of a profound irony in that we're promoting a social impact commons via Zoom conversations, because that's not how if that's the new normal, if that's how we've decided that we're going to have our commons, that the commons is in the metaverse, and, your colleagues are maybe in Boston or they're maybe across the world, and so on and so forth. It's actually like whatever impact you're getting, maybe you're going to get some sort of amazing data streams out of it, but it's not going to be very good communication. So this is how I started this morning, but I really wanted to talk with Mr. Squire about social prescribing and how this fits into essentially gamification of smart cities and this idea of managed complexity, or as Rodrigo has commented on a number of my neuroeconomic programs, this idea of self-guided development, or like self-guided, like that we are going to be engineered through the blockchain and through these cybernetic reinforcement loops towards some sort of like the world sensorium and the global brain. And that this will be done for our own good, and it will largely include a lot of data about our intimate lives and our intimate social relations, of which arts and culture is pretty central. And so I'm going to start off with a clip. The sound quality isn't great. I apologize for that, but it's about 4 minutes, and it's talking about the idea that in the future, here we go. This is why the arts are a shadow health service. Here's why. And this was an article in The Conversation on Medium from 2018. The UK's Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has said doctors should prescribe dance classes and trips to concert halls, as well as pills and physio to set out plans for social prescribing. And I've talked about health-based social prescribing already, but here's where we're at. We're moving into this health prescribing space. This was already planned out before the lockdowns, right? And so, part of what I've been trying to caution folks on, in the alternative health space is that this was the plan all along, was to sort of create these new opportunities in social prescribing. And that after, like, when all of you guys were really concerned about talking about, like, well, what about vitamin D? Well, what about all of these other things we could be prescribing instead of injections? Well, they knew that this was coming, right? Matt Hancock of the UK Health Department knew that social prescribing was the next game. And so this is what I've been trying to explain to people, that they herd you into the next thing, their next solution. So below that is an article from the British Council. They're talking about how engaging in the arts can improve your physical and mental health, because we know that mental health is a huge aspect of this right now. And there's all sorts of links underneath from 2020 and 2022 about developments in the social prescribing space. And again, British Council, that is the next imperial, winning hearts and minds, through arts and culture was the program of British Council. And underneath they're mentioning this idea of Epi Arts Lab, which is actually the lab that's going to be talked about in this clip. It's in Florida, I think at the University of Florida, Gainesville. So they're linking epidemiology and public health to arts and culture. There's a reference to a PBS NewsHour segment on a program called Canvas. Now, that was funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and they also happen to be the funders of the Social Impact Commons Incubator for Commons Management. Then there's a reference about the arts being available on prescription from 2018. And there are resources on social prescribing, including a toolkit from the World Health Organization, and also an evaluation on culture RX, like cultural prescribing, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I'm going to get into that a bit later as well. But I think we need to understand that what's coming is a game of culture in ubiquitous sensing, right? The outside-in robot, in which the way we play the game and perform in the space, both from our physical health and our mental health and our reskilling in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, will lead to developments in teaming, tracking us all on blockchain, and potentially help build out the world sensorium. And so I'm just going to give you the overview of the larger context of the larger map here, and zoom into a bit on what I've been working on the last few days. And this relates in part to this idea of holons. Holons are these little circular units, and like the cybernetic cells, like the cells in the slime mold, before they make the slug. And that there's something called Game B, which is a game of decentralized self-organizing units. And this was being advanced by Jim Rutt when he was a fellow at the Santa Fe Institute. And so then I spent some time today also working yesterday on the Santa Fe Institute, and George Cowan, who was part of the Manhattan Project. He was at the Met Lab in Chicago, and then later went on to Los Alamos. He had a career at Los Alamos in doing forensics around nuclear fallout. And then in the 80s created this systems of to study in an interdisciplinary way complexity studies and applying physics to arts and culture, and specifically economics, helping pioneer the field of econophysics with a lot of funding from the MacArthur Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation and Citigroup, who was then under management by John Reed. And so at the end of all of that yesterday, I was really excited. I sent a few friends like this little structure here because I'm like, I was looking again at Balaji Srinivasan, and I think he came to my attention. Sebs had been doing some work both on the Halan and sort of social evolution and autopoiesis, and mentioning Srinivasan and his book on the network state, essentially how to create a new country in through blockchain networking. And part of what he was advancing was something called a ledger of record. And this idea, which is not unlike what I've talked about in the past, of the Alphabet, Google Alphabet's plan that we all have a mind file, or we all have sort of a purpose-built ledger that is goal-driven, that advances us and improves our outcomes according to some predefined way of being in the world, potentially to have a mind file to do, outer space colonization, but having ledgers not just of individuals, but at all levels. So at all of these fractal levels, both of the nanobots inside your neurons in your brain, all the way up to social systems, and they're trying to get rid of nation states, but like the world at a global world as a whole, and even this interplanetary Filecoin protocol. At all fractal levels, there would be this ledger, and in this idea is from the ledger you could start to make decisions about futures for societies. And this is something that Sebs has talked about also, this futarchy with Robin Hanson. And then it came back out with Vitalik Buterin, this idea of linking new ways of voting. Robin Hanson came out with this idea in 2000 that you would do this liquid democracy where you have tokens, and that people are encouraged to vote on certain outcomes from among different choice sets. And if your vote, quote unquote, for the outcome that you chose actually had the best outcome, that you would be paid back in some sort of token delivery system, or there would be some benefit that would accrue to you for making the good choice, and then using sort of swarm intelligence to make social improvement. Now, and then the good choices would be, as decided by data, would be run through the smart contract layer. This smart contract layer would be tracking probably a number of different choices to get the best outcome based on its metrics, the success metrics. And then the one that won would be fed into sort of the decision tree for future reference on prediction markets. And so it goes around and around. And that eventually this massive radical participatory voting on supposed public goods, although the idea is that we're not all going to be deciding what is a public good. It could be that someone is deciding that essentially, everyone having a brain-computer interface is a public good, and Mark Andreessen should, fund, the research to get us all with our upgrades to have our own neural transducers so we can all have the best brain upgrade. And that is they could decide that's a public good. And who's to say if we would have any vote, those of us who might not think that that's actually a good thing, but there will be some good that's decided. There will be a range of choices. There will be voting. There will be diversity. And then from this managed diversity and teaming systems, their intention is to converge on this next phase of human evolution. And that's up here in this map. This idea of the world brain with Oliver Reiser that I've talked about before, and really Julian Huxley. That's the end game of their eugenics protocol, is some sort of new emergent system of organized information in maybe some sort of light-based optic photonic communication medium that is this collective, that is a guided swarm collective consciousness. And so as far as it is to imagine that tokens tied to social prescribing would ultimately lead into feed into this narrative of a collective public good on blockchain, a defining of choices among different kinds of game theory. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, like in game theory, this is George Cowan in the arrow here. He's the founder of the Santa Fe Institute, and this is the Los Alamos Labs Friday night poker game that went on for years. So these are all of these like high-level physicists, planning for what's coming next, right? Based on this poker game, and Actually, here's George Cowan over here, and then this is Stan Ulam. And Stan Ulam was he developed something called the Monte Carlo method, which is this using high-powered computers to look at different options in the world and then sort of choose one. And so I feel like that's really what this network state ledger is going to be for, is that there will be a series of options that will model different future forecasts, and then certain ones will be chosen. And then from that, so it's almost like in this Monte Carlo model, it's like a simulated multiverse in there. So anyway, that's kind of intense. But this is important because actually Stan Ulam participated in something. It was a symposium at the Worcester Institute here in Philadelphia. The Worcester Institute is the first biotechnology center. I think it dates to the late 19th century. It's actually on Penn's campus. And in 1966, Stan Ulam was among a number of participants in a gathering that essentially reevaluated neo-Darwinian evolution and said that mathematically it didn't really make sense, and that they felt like there was something else they needed in their toolkit, which I think is, ultimately this idea of, God, or this larger force beyond the material. And I think after that time is probably when they started pouring a lot of money, the Templeton Foundation, which is sort of up here in this area, John Templeton, this idea of spirituality and spiritual capital. And this feeds very much into the push for ecumenicalism, because they'll want to understand God across many different faith practices, and then how that feeds into this evolutionary imperative. So actually, before I start that, maybe I'll just go ahead and play this clip about evolution, because I think it's important that we situate it in this understanding that there is the imperative. That is what Huxley, that's what the Fabians were all about, dating back to the Enlightenment, that we will engineer society towards this next end. So let me see. This will pull up.
50 years ago today, there was a remarkable meeting held at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia that's had a tremendous influence on thinking over the past 50 years about the nature of the evolutionary process. Briefly, what happened was a group of physicists and engineers took an interest in biology. And they took an interest in particular in the basic logic of the Darwinian process. And thinking very much as engineers do, namely asking the question, will it work, right? An engineer just can't wave his hands. Either the plane flies or it doesn't. The bridge stands or it doesn't. They're very practical minded. These engineers, and that's a bit of a simplification, these are professors at places like MIT, like Murray Eden. They said, it looks like the math is not going to cooperate. You've got a search condition in the first step of natural selection where you are looking at a selection of random outcomes provided to you by mutation. What that means is that unlike an engineered system where you can bias the outcome using your intellect to aim at the target you want, in evolution, in neo-Darwinian evolution, your raw materials, so to speak, are being provided to you essentially by a roulette wheel. I'm mixing metaphors here, but the idea is you're having to make the best of a series of random outcomes. Randomness, by definition, is undirected, meaning that the process is waiting on, as it's looking to move towards a particular functional outcome, is waiting on the deliverances of a giant lottery wheel, or, pick any particular random process you want. The mathematics of that, as you carry it through, raise severe challenges for getting that process as a whole, the whole of the evolutionary process, to go where you want, which is namely to build you bacterial cells or plants or animals or any complex integrated system. And what happened was these engineers got together, very, very bright guys, engineers and physicists, and they invited their friends on the faculties of places like Harvard and so forth, MIT. They went and knocked on the door, the office doors of the biologists, and they said, we think we've got a problem here, and we're going to have a symposium to talk about this and sort it out. And it was then known, the publication that came out of this was known as Mathematical Challenges to the Neo-Darwinian Interpretation of Evolution. So these critics accept that there was some evolutionary process that occurred. That wasn't at issue. What was at issue was the neo-Darwinian understanding of how this had happened. And what's remarkable about the Wistar document is you see the papers from the various authors, both pro and con, with respect to neo-Darwinism, and then transcripts of the discussions are included. And these transcripts are very lively reading. So at certain points in the wake of a talk, people are yelling at each other. You can almost see chairs being thrown. This meeting must have been incredible to attend. And I recommend to anyone who wants to take the time, find that book. Again, the title is Mathematical Challenges to the Neo-Darwinian Interpretation of Evolution, and read through it. And it's quite revealing. The puzzle that they focused on was unsolved in 1966, and it's unsolved today. And it's unsolved because of a deeper question, and that is all parties, I think almost without exception at that meeting, all parties to the debate would have agreed that to explain any living thing, you are limited to natural processes and chance, right? So if you think about having an explanatory toolkit, you pop the lid on your toolbox and look inside, you've got natural processes, whatever they happen to be, and chance events, and that's it. No appeals to intelligence, to guidance, to teleology were allowed. All right, you can play that game, right? But that means if the products you're looking at, if the things you wish to explain were in fact caused by intelligence, and that's what actually happened, you are not going to be able to solve your problem because your toolkit is too small. So it's a fascinating document. It was an incredible meeting, but it highlights the limits that a materialist understanding of reality places on your freedom as a scientist to say, you know what, this system that I'm looking at requires intelligence, and I need a better toolkit. This one's not going to work, right? That wasn't an option for anybody there. But you can see very clearly, especially in the papers of these physicists and engineers, they realize neo-Darwinism does not work. And I think in the intervening 5 decades, the evolutionary biology community itself has finally awakened to this. So, in November, at the Royal Society in London, a meeting has been convened that will be, I predict, very much like Wistar in its consequences, where the assembled speakers are going to say, our current theory is bust, and we need to try something else. And again, the question will be, all right, are you going to play only in the materialist boundary lines, or are you going to have the courage to go beyond that?
Yeah, that's pretty incredible, I think. Let me see over here if I can get over. Yeah, so I just want to take a minute and just sit with that, right? And this feels important to me, again, because it's in my backyard. Like, you never know when you go looking. Again, Philadelphia has a backyard that's pretty rich with a lot of information, but that this conference was actually held like on Penn's campus. And, I have my graduate degree is from Penn, and I'm going to try to get my hands on that book because I feel like that's where we're going. Like, that's that idea of moving beyond the materialist understanding is where their headspace is. And then I think increasingly it's where we need to understand, like, how we navigate through the labyrinth of the game that they are trying to overlay on the world, that's really important. So I'm going to play this other quick. This is a shorter one. This is about the Monte Carlo method, and this is what Stan Ulam helped develop. And it's interesting because I don't know if you can see this image. It's actually the bottom of a desk drawer. We went to Los Alamos for our, we went to New Mexico for our summer vacation, and I wanted to go to Los Alamos, and I wanted to go to the historic district, and one of the, even the highest level scientists there, it had been a Boy Scout camp, and there were just a few buildings, and actually most of the rest of the infrastructure was pretty wretched. But if you were like at the high level, you actually got one of these little bungalow houses, and one of them had been converted to a museum. And in one of the rooms of one of those bungalows, there was a big wooden bulky desk that was Stan Ulam's desk. Now, in addition to doing the Monte Carlo algorithm, he also helped do the math behind the hydrogen bomb with Teller. And so in the bottom of this desk drawer, because it was open and you could take a picture, it says, a mathematician does something on a piece of paper, and then lo and behold, a big explosion may occur. And so I think in many respects that big, and it says S. Ulam, Phila-1967. Now, that's where I went looking, where I found that clip, was that I was trying to figure out what Stan Ulam was doing in Philadelphia. Now, we also had ENIAC, the early computer from World War II was developed on Penn's campus, but that was much earlier. And I never quite figured out why that is dated Philadelphia 1967. But I really think that this idea of the Cold War and the nuclear threat was really ushering in the next phase, which is a war on consciousness, which is a war on sacred and on spirituality. And so that equation of the mathematician, yes, he could have been talking about the hydrogen bomb there, but I think in some ways this Monte Carlo method tied with simulation and bioengineering is perhaps even more compelling and relevant to where we are now. So I'm just going to play this clip.
A Monte Carlo simulation is a method of probability analysis done by running a number of variables through a model in order to determine the different outcomes. By using Monte Carlo simulations, decision makers are able to determine the range of possibilities and their probability of occurrence for any choice of actions. The Monte Carlo simulation is named for the city of Monte Carlo, which is known for its beautiful casinos. The reference to casinos is appropriate, since Monte Carlo simulations use randomness, much like the slot machines, dice, and roulette wheels in a casino. A Monte Carlo simulation works by constructing a mathematical model of the decision under consideration. Then the simulation is run for any uncertain aspects of that model. Different random variables are put into these uncertain parts of the model until there are enough outcomes to plot on a probability distribution curve. This is usually done on computers because the Monte Carlo simulation can be run tens of thousands of times in order to cover all possible outcomes. Based on the shape of the probability distribution curve created by the Monte Carlo simulation, decision makers will know where their ultimate decision falls within the various probabilities. They then make their decision based on the risk they are willing to take to get the outcome they want or need.
All right. So to me, when I see this kind of image with these different pathways and these different options, and again, when you think that, Cowan, who came out of Los Alamos, these are the centers for supercomputing. And that's something that I don't think, if more people in the public understood, at least in the United States, like the history of the Department of Energy and the Atomic Energy Commission, and how the Cold War and the nuclear program segues into the Human Genome Project, right, into this high-level complex systems theory modeling, I think we would have a better understanding of where things are going. Because to me, when I see all of those different charts, I imagine that's almost like a multiverse, right? Like that is, you have these variables and many different decision trees. And then from these decision trees, like optimal outcomes are decided. And so, when I went back to that circle, the idea of a goal-driven ledger, right? And so when you might have your own goal-driven ledger. I mean, who knows? Like maybe your stomach has its own goal-driven ledger, or different parts of your body, like your hips have a goal. Like I don't know. My husband has his knee problem. He's always doing like physical therapy to try to, like, maybe that would have a ledger. Your body as a whole has a ledger. Your neighborhood has a ledger. All of these different ledgers sort of interconnected and syncing up with different outcomes and different probabilities. And then if you imagine that within the blockchain space, within this decentralized finance or regenerative finance, somebody's deciding what the good outcome looks like. And sometimes it might be obvious, but sometimes it might not be so obvious, or what's good for you is not good for your neighbor or, you know, your kid or something like that. Like there's not one universal good outcome for many things. It gets complicated. And then with bets being placed and this idea of running it through protocol layers, sifting through the decision trees and then feeding it back in, I feel like all of this is about, you know, when they were talking about, you know, evolution and that they couldn't, the neo-Darwinian outlook didn't, their toolbox needed something that they didn't have. The toolbox that they have was insufficient to explain the evolution of species as they had it, exclusively mathematical. And so I'm feeling like what these people are doing in lieu of, because I don't, you know, they can't be God, is that they're trying to create simulations and usher us into a simulation that they can control the outcomes. And in a weird way, like that the digital almost becomes the material reality. Like we substitute a material reality that has a biophytonic or energetic connection to the sacred and the divine for a militarized simulation that almost becomes hyper-material, even though it's digital, because it all is controlled at every level by these control grid systems. But to get us into that space, to herd the masses into the simulation, they need to control curiosity, imagination, faith. Those are all things that have to be reduced and limited into the machine and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. And I think we can see that happening with all of the social media and the sugarscape artificial societies. And, you know, once you have lockdown culture, or like today, you know, this Mr. Squire, he wasn't going to meet me in person. He could only meet me on Zoom, even though he was supposedly an advocate of the commons. Like, it's a commons, but I'm holed up in my house and I don't know who you are, so I'm not going to meet you in person. Like the serendipity of, you know, him actually getting all of this information and maybe looking at the work he's doing with the new lens, that's not going to happen in the Zoom world, right? And so our world has to continue to be narrowed and narrowed. But for now, we're not there yet. We're not into that space yet. And so there's this wide net that's being cast around the more subtle aspects of our lives to try to get it contained. And so I think that's why there's so much of an emphasis on arts and culture programming, that you know, it's not to say that the arts were always free, right? Because there were always patrons of the arts. The arts were controlled by the elite and the wealthy. But that in this new zone, there actually, it's a quest, I think, for the imagination, for the creative potential at all levels. And so if you can link art and culture experiences to public health, right? The imperatives of public health, right? You have to do this for the public health and for the public good. Actually, you know, what they're going to be framing is these cultural institutions as a public good, which, yes, they are, but in the cybernetic system. So we will fund them with tokens as a public good so that we can get the data to further refine our Monte Carlo prediction models. And so with all of that in mind, I'm now going to pull this clip about social prescribing. And again, realize that this is embedded in the British Council, right? So this is part of Digital Empire. They're linking public health and epigenetics to this. And this idea of the creative economy, that all of creativity must be channeled into an economic construct. And as such, at that point, you can pull it into like econophysics and modeling, the simulation modeling. If you can make creativity an economic function, then you can start to model it in the machine. So let me just pull up. Okay. So apologies on this one. The sound quality isn't great. This one is about 4 minutes.
Of the impacts that are actually happening. So I think that we can start to then take all of these many cultures of practice into a future where we understand that when I show up at a hospital with anxiety and headaches, that a prescription for a pottery class may be the thing that I need. And in the activation of those layers of networks, we can collectively as a society save money, get better outcomes, and have your local neighborhood artist be a key provider of a fully and holistically well-lived life by the standards of many of our grandmothers.
In terms of like the infrastructure to support what you're talking about, Anya, and what this vision is, what are some of the policy things? What are some of the investments that can be made now to get us to that point? Again, I was talking about making the case and sort of building a shared language around it, but something like, I'm going to plant the seed, social prescribing is happening in the UK, in Canada. What would it take to have that here?
Social prescribing, that was kind of what I was referring to when I talked about showing up at a hospital with anxiety symptoms. In the UK, some of our partners have participated in a process that led to that reality. One of our partners has been doing work on epidemiological models, looking at large cohort data, which looks at data and can show correlations in a very specific way between arts participation and very particular phenomena like inflammation, for instance, or heart disease over the course of long periods of times over large numbers of people. And the correlations were so strong that they were able to then move what we call moving the policy needle. They were able to move the policy needle in order to set up a structure where individuals like myself that might show up in a hospital with anxiety symptoms could be referred to a person that called a social prescriber, and not a concierge, like an arts concierge. And the concierge is someone who would be a concierge for a social prescription. So I have a social prescription to go and participate in some sort of participatory art form. The concierge are trained to sort of intake me, interview me, ask me questions about who I am, how I live, what kind of time I have, what my interests are, and then kind of match me to an arts practice that would that matches my prescription and my needs. A structure like that delivered outcomes in the UK where they were finding that as a whole, their costs were going down because the cost of moving a person with average lack of sleep and anxiety symptoms through the medical system were much higher than diverting me to a concierge that landed me in my pottery class. Is, I think, a model that we are in the process of beginning to work to step down the paths here in the United States. And at the Center for Arts and Medicine, we are going to start working at our Epi Arts Lab, which is about to launch, and on a large set of data that is available here in Florida, which will be the first U.S. epidemiological study of that scale.
All right. So, yeah, I'm interested if you're in the chat, like if you're what you're hearing in this clip. This was about a 20-minute talk. The woman who's primarily speaking there in the bottom row is connected to the University of Florida, Gainesville, I believe, and they were developing this Epi Arts Lab, and you can see that in the February 2020, right? Interesting timing. The Epi Arts Lab is featured in the news in this press release, and Florida is also a center for military gaming technology and simulation technology, and it's a crypto hub, and it's the Space Coast, which is also a lot having to do with the satellites for monitoring everything. And And early on in the talk that she gave, she mentioned about the importance of like, how should we say, like community-based art, that it's not all elite art, but that you can find art at street fairs, you can find art in churches, like the song, or at funerals, or a number of different things. She mentioned that her father was Nigerian and she was involved in dance. And so like the informal arts opportunities were really central. And for me, what stood out is when she's talking about this idea of a concierge, right? This concierge service. And, I will say someone that I connected with early in the space, and we were researching some of these early pilots in impact finance in California. This guy, Fred Ferrer, who was with Rocket Ship Academy Charter Schools, he was talking about the community schools and health-based systems in the schools and this transition towards concierge healthcare. And you can imagine, like, it's not just going to be a person that's doing your intake and asking you all these questions, right? We just had this conversation about Epic healthcare records, right? It's going to be an AI that is matching people up. And the idea that you can address like serious concerns. I mean, she's saying anxiety, but like if you're in the emergency room, like that is very serious. Like you're in a state of probably potential some level of self-harm, that you're going to prescribe someone a pottery class, right? And that's going to resolve their problems. I mean, this is not addressing the economic upheaval that is about to happen. It's not addressing like the social upheaval that is happening and the disintegration of actual authentic human relationships. None of those are going to be addressed by your social prescription. And yet you will be tracked against your compliance with the social prescription. And you might have heard like inflammation and heart things, like where are the wearables in that? Where are the health testing, right? If you get a pottery class, are you going to have to wear a wearable? Are you going to have to like test your blood and see if what your diabetes management system is and feed that into the health portal to justify access to the classes? So this is really important to consider. Now, I will say the other piece of this is, for me, and this is what I'm sort of working through, is the idea, she talks about, your local pottery educator being, an important member of the community. And sure, I don't want people to not have access to things like pottery classes, but I don't want them to be an impact market. And I don't want the people taking the classes or the people doing the education to somehow become incorporated as sensors in the outside-in robot for some collective consciousness program. I mean, that's not what I want at all. But I can see when we're talking about social currency and this idea that Bernard Lietaer has talked about like a monetary ecology of social currencies that carry our values, that are signals to our values. And that's something that this guy Jim Rutt has talked about when I was touching on this game B of decentralized self-organizing. Jim Rutt graduated from MIT, and his early career was with Network Solutions, and they were running Network Solutions took the contract from the National Science Foundation to like parcel out the .com, .org, .net things until it sold it off in 2000, and then he became a fellow at the Santa Fe Institute. But he's specifically talking about money as a social signal and using tokens for coordination systems. So I could easily foresee social prescribing having some sort of alternative currency attached to it, that would link to the evidence, right? Evidence-based impact for the people who are delivering the services, right? And, I'll just say, I worked at a public garden and we had education programs. We offered monthly programs for homeschool families. And in the ways that the public school teachers were identified and tracked against their children's test scores as data, on the blockchain, all of the people in the informal economy, in the nonprofit sector, they're also going to be assigned unique identifiers and have the impact of their contributions educationally to the young or to those being retrained. that's going to be part of the program, is that they're going to actually, there's going to be some soul-bound token attached to each of the people that take their classes, and then that's going to be fed into the system. So at some future point, the economic productivity or the mental health stability of the people who are that you provided services to are going to be interconnected and interrelated based on your social capital in the space as some sort of like knowledge-based entrepreneur. And I think that in the exchange of those tokens, those are going to also include the soul-bound tokens that carry the metadata and the impact data, as well as alternative payment systems. And we could see some. There was a woman, I think her name is Tashi. She had like Tashi Talks, but she's in Australia, and she was talking about during lockdowns that family members were not allowed to visit their family members who lived outside their household, and yet there were systems set up that volunteers could provide emotional support to your family members. Even though relatives were not allowed to see each other, volunteers had access that relatives did not. And so I think that this entire culture of volunteerism as an alternative is going to be fed in unsettling ways, which is not to say that it isn't rewarding to volunteer or that people shouldn't have access to arts and culture. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I think we can't examine how things are unfolding, especially when we see things like, the Social Impact Commons Incubator for Commons Management, funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, who's, the Mellon family. Andrew Mellon was let's see, he was the Secretary of the Treasury under 3 presidents, right? And based again in Pittsburgh. So we've got, that whole Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, Pitcairn Mellon family going on there, that they're the ones who are underwriting this management of the tokens as a DAO. And I will just pull this up. This is from the website, the Social Impact Commons. You may know blockchain as the technology that powers cryptocurrency, but has vast applications, including creating a new kind of organization, distributed autonomous organizations, the DAO. Might DAOs be the next generation of fiscal sponsors? And so, can these organizations be tax exempt? Join, with this expert and find out about it. And this is coming up on December 1st of 2022. And, as I said the last time out, I said, if we're not spending 50% of our time interrogating Web3, we're missing the mark, folks, because essentially what a fiscal sponsorship is, if people are not familiar, it's this idea that if you're sort of a small entity, like you're just getting started in the third sector space, and you haven't done all the paperwork to be your own nonprofit, that you can contract with an established nonprofit organization and use their umbrella to go after grant money or donor money to do your projects. And then eventually, I guess the expectation is that you'll go ahead, and assuming you're going to be in the space for a long time and not just a one-off, that you'll do the work and you'll become your own 501c3. So clearly, there are issues with the third sector. It is a central feature of the impact economy. But what I would say is they want nimble. They want agile. They want resilient. That is what this complexity theory is. And, they're planning a future that is totally destabilized all the time. They're planning for a lot of nonprofits to not have sufficient resources, and to be to pop up. They want the pop-up model. Pop up, do a task. It's like nonprofit arts and culture gig economy, and then go down, and then reorganize and do a new pop-up, and then go down. And so this rapid cycling, I believe, the rapid cycling and this idea of eclectic teaming, which is also part of the tokenization. And let me just go back up to the stigmergy. This collective intelligence for social good, linking it into swarm behaviors. This idea of using socio-technical environments, smart sensing environments, tokenized environments, data analytics, that will help us towards our optimization and efficient problem solving. That we will do this swarm gatherings, and I think the swarm gatherings are conducive to the pop-up model. Like that, you're not going to have a nonprofit like the one I worked at that's been around since the 1890s. You're going to have one that pops up and then they go down, and then that is more efficient for this model of data collection. And that is what's the program of developing complex behavior. That is part of this swarm intelligence. I have an article here from the Harvard Business Review. Swarm intelligence, a new way to think about business. That this idea of the temporary swarm with different agents involved is what is moving towards. And this idea of teaming, that we will be submitting our agency into the larger collective for the purpose of finishing a task with just-in-time labor. And this idea for teaming and mobile robots goes back to the 80s. Here I have an abstract from a paper by Rodney Brooks, a robust layer control system for a mobile robot. Now, we're going to be their mobile robots. I mean, just-in-time gig labor, we're going to be the mobile robots for this. And part of this links to, let me see if if I have, that they're using tokens for scalable team coordination. This is another paper. Token-based approach for scalable team coordination. Efficient coordination among large numbers of heterogeneous agents promises to revolutionize the way in which some complex tasks, such as responding to urban disasters, can be performed. However, state-of-the-art coordination algorithms aren't capable of achieving efficient and effective coordination when A is very large. Building on recent successful token-based algorithms for task allocation and information sharing, we have developed an integrated and efficient approach to coordinating large-scale teams. We use tokens. So they're talking about the use of tokens in teaming, and then this was actually part of Capital One's effort. This was discussed in the Harvard Business Review, that Jim Donaghy, when Capital One began to scale nationally very rapidly, they had to start doing more bottom-up management instead of top-down. And they were doing that by assigning tokens that reinforced corporate culture and corporate behavior, and that they reinforced the corporate culture through the use of tokens and coordinated that. At that time, it was just gaming chips. It wasn't digital, but that's part of this corporate leaderboard culture, is the tokenization. So again, I just want to talk about the way in which if we have these quote unquote like agile nonprofits, which I think is the plan, one of the people backing or advocating for this tokenized common, she's Nadia Shmavonian, is with Sea Change Capital and the Repositioning Fund. The Repositioning Fund it seems to be transitioning nonprofits to this new model. They're talking about wise impact and quality sponsorships and life cycle phases of social purpose agencies, which makes it sound like they're going to be phasing them out. This is from the Twitter feed of the Repositioning Fund, which is based in Philadelphia. They just joined Twitter in 2015, but they're in March of 2021. They're talking about the troubled nature of the financial health of nonprofits in the city. Like, no duh, right? They did the lockdowns and they pretty much tried to kill off all of the nonprofit, and destabilize them, except for the ones that were selected, who will be selected to be the social prescribing centers. Here's another one from December of 2020, a retweet with the Scattergood Foundation, which is mental health. And they're talking about using data to guide nonprofits through an uncertain future, right? So they've done the deconstruction of the third sector nonprofit space, and then they are reintroducing this agile format. But what they're saying is, if you have a DAO as your umbrella now for a fiscal sponsor, that's a protocol. That's the smart contract protocol. So then, we've gone back up to this emergent convergence program here with the network state, where we're feeding this data, right, that under the guise of a fiscal sponsorship, we'll feed the data into the smart contract so that we can get it to evaluate the public good, evaluate the fitness landscape and how it all fits together. And dollars to donuts, like I can imagine this DAO, it's just going to be some sort of app, right? And they'll go out to some young people who are, I don't know, maybe have their own podcast or some pop-up, theater group or whatever, and say, hey, we've got this new thing. Like, do you want donor money? Like, we can totally hook you up with some, people who've made a lot of money in the crypto space or the blockchain space, right? And they're all social entrepreneurs and they want to support the arts. So here, just sign up on our app and you can get, you can get, hooked into our system, right, with the tokens, and then you can stake your tokens and you can do all this stuff. Like, I feel like that's under this layer of the DAO fiscal sponsorship. Like, no one's going to read all the fine print. Like, they're not going to know, like, they sign up for this app and suddenly they get pulled into this network of, like, won't you be my censor for, consciousness studies, of arts and culture into the World Sensorium. They're not going to know that. Like, nobody, I mean, I would assume probably most of the people have no idea of, like, all of this stigmergy and self-organization and task allocation and the way in which this supposed playful gamified space is going to shape our consciousness, right? How our radical participatory voting with genetic algorithms and, shared mind spaces is going to like totally break down any sort of like personal agency we have in the world and force us into this weird, profane gaming simulation. They're just not going to know. They're just going to think that like they have a great idea for a grant and a project and they're just looking for an easy way to make it happen, right? They're not imagining that they're going to be part of some sort of social currency monetary ecology system. So again, the one thing about the Mellon family, and I don't know that I actually have this here. Oh, maybe here. That I thought was quite interesting, actually. So the Mellon family, Paul Mellon and his first wife, she was really into Jungian stuff. And so they essentially, the Mellon family created this Bollingen Foundation to acquire rights to publish all of the Jungian stuff and as well as a lot of other esoteric text. It was like a university publishing house that was like all sorts of really eclectic things. There's a blog here about it, the Bollingen Library and Joseph Campbell. But a lot of the Esalen, a lot of the consciousness stuff, the Mellon family was sort of mixed up in that. Let me see. With Love and Money. The Bollingen Foundation. So they're interested in archetypes, right? We were talking about the neuroeconomy stuff being at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and the waveforms, right? I keep saying the waveforms of matter, physics, economy, thought is really central. So it says his work, Paul Mellon's first wife, Mary Conover Mellon, began reading Carl Jung's work in 1934. And in 1937, she and her husband heard him speak at the Analytical Psychology Club in New York. Though I don't know what he means, Mary wrote after the lecture, this has something very much to do with me. She conceived of a plan that would make the work of Jung available in English in a uniform edition. The foundation established to achieve this publishing goal she called Bollingen, the name Jung had given to his personal retreat outside of Zurich, where Mary Mellon proposed the project to him on a visit in 1940. Although it was greatly influenced from its beginning by an international network, it moved on to publishing works on myth, symbol, the occult, and esoteric traditions. So that's really interesting, right? I mean, again, the Mellon family, it's not directly Paul Mellon, but it is that milieu that is involved with funding social prescribing and the arts. A lot of the National Gallery of Art was sponsored by the Mellon family. So these archetypes, right, and how we tell stories, and we live in stories. So that's really important. I will say that Mr. Squire, before he got involved in the Tokenized Commons. He was like, and these are all things I love. Like, don't get me wrong. I love arts and culture and diversity. I just never really imagined it all hooked into a blockchain cybernetic feedback system. He did something called Hidden City Philadelphia. And again, Philadelphia has all of these amazing programs, and they would go into sort of abandoned spaces like the Metropolitan Opera House, which has now since been renovated. This was in 2009, and have these really unique art experiences in unusual locations. So Hidden City, but hidden, I mean, occult is also like another word for hidden. And then he was involved in Culture Works, which was a co-working space for arts organizations, and helping develop that as a real estate venture. Now, I will say that when I was talking about some of the stigmergy and swarm intelligence, that there had actually been, there was an article about the use of stigmergy in co-working spaces. Let me see. Foraging and allocation, the robot tracker. Oh, stigmergy in co-working environments, right? So these things, they're interested in creating spaces that have emergent energy attached to them. Like, they're really interested in monitoring and then coming up with artificial pheromones to track sort of chemosensory attraction. Like, okay, ants have pheromones, so what does it look like with people in co-working spaces? And WeWork actually had a lot of Internet of Things sensors attached in it, and they framed it as being about efficiency and utilization of desk space, but I think it was definitely about more than that. So in the map, I have an article that's linked on co-working's cooperation paradox on the role of stigmergic curation. And again, this fits in with this complex systems analysis that the whole may be more than the sum of the parts, that you get the right people in the right room and sort of exciting things happen. Then I have another article that's talking about bio-inspired artificial pheromone systems for swarm robotics. So how do you create tracking systems and reinforcement mechanisms that are the kind that social insects used for both machines and people, and this idea of teaming, and we'll go back to teaming again in a minute, but this idea, with Melanie Swan's CloudMind programs, the future of your brain-computer interface, blockchaining your way into a cloud mind, that they're envisioning that in the future, we will start to enter into shared online spaces with other humans and non-human entities that could be animals or machines or something else, and that would all be tracked on blockchain. So and then the framing of this as like an art project, a lot of the stuff I've been adding in relates to this from Bitcoin to Burning Man book that Leotere was part of. I've been gradually adding the people who wrote the different chapters, and I'll link to the map, and the link to the book is in there. I'd highly recommend spending some time on it. It's pretty readable, and it's from 2014, so it's getting on there, at least in like blockchain years. It's getting kind of aged, but in this space, I came across so this woman, you have to check out her LinkedIn. She's a Romanian scientist working in distributed intelligent systems. It's Mihaela Ulieru. She went to Berkeley and then spent time in the Canadian government in sort of self-emerging security systems, and is now a part of something called the Consilience Project. Consilience is part of that E.O. Wilson sociobiology. She's also connected to Input Output Hong Kong, which is, the Cardano stuff. That she's the strategic impact officer there, and the chief alchemist at SingularityNet. So she's been around the block. She knows, the Standard World Economic Forum, connection. But out of the Consilience Project, is it talking about, oh no. Well, her chapter in the book was about holons. So she was discussing holarchy. That was part of her chapter in the book that I might actually go back at some point and just read it out loud, because it's definitely worthwhile. But they were looking at this idea of individual minds and group minds and how they intersect. And so I think that really this idea of forced medical procedures goes really far down the way of like breaking down our bodily autonomy and our own decisions. And it's not going to stop with our material bodies. It's going to start to move into our minds and the expectation that our minds should be shared with the collective, and that there's an entitlement there. So this is the image from her chapter. The two polar ways of understanding: an individual mind, which is individual holons, and then the group mind, which is that you would start to feel, you would have empathy to the point that you would actually start to feel other people's feelings. And if you noticed, like, I hadn't realized that the United Nations has a huge section on empathy, and you know what? I'll link the map when I'm done. I'm not coordinated enough to put the map in now. But so the UN has a real huge emphasis on empathy and virtual reality for empathy. And I think it's part of like building this like social normalization, that we can start to actually occupy other people's mind space in a more immediate way. Not that we shouldn't have empathy, but that in a mechanical way that we would occupy someone else's mind. And I do think that this is also embedded within the social emotional learning push for kids in schools, that there's this idea that there is a fluid mind and that we go back and forth and we are part of each other's minds. But an example of this, one of the other people who was connected with the book, he helped develop this thing called the Tree of Tenere, which was premiered at Burning Man, but then they had some spin-offs, and this one actually was installed in Dallas. And it's a fake tree with LED lights on it, and the leaves change color depending on the folks at Burning Man. When it was tried out, I think in 2016, they would wear these Muse headbands and then collectively enter through these biofeedback loops into like a state with this LED tree to change the colors. And then somehow they would get feedback from the group of the other participants in the headbands against the tree. So again, it's this aberration of nature and pushing everything into some sort of photonic simulation. But this idea that we start to blend with each other in collective mind is part of that. And I think arts and culture is a way, because it transcends like music, poetry, drama, it does tap into that really inner state, like that state of flow, that I think that is another reason that they are hooking that arts and culture into the public health space, not just to financialize it for the pay for success, which is what I initially thought, but that they're trying to condition us with wearables and experiencing art through and even art ownership on blockchain and layers, to experience art both viscerally with this wearable writing on our consciousness, and then having some sort of idea of collective ownership in art through this tokenization. And I think we see that also with sports. Okay, so anyway, yeah. And you know, just to say, you know, I keep going back, and this is my own lived experience. Like, I love arts and culture. I love diversity. It never would have occurred to me that this was all about modeling and simulation and complexity theory. You know, I worked at this botanic garden for 17 years, and I loved it. And I don't think any of the people there, I mean, I'm not there to remind them anymore of what's coming, but they don't know. They just go along and they do what's immediately in front of them, and they don't know about any of the dual use. And so back in the day, when I was sort of first starting out, and before that, I actually spent some time at the Please Touch Museum, which was a children's museum. And there was this idea that the arts and culture complemented the economy, and that they wanted to qualify it and measure it all out. And I even went to some of these little seminars, the launches of the report, like how much the arts and the creative economy feeds the Philadelphia economy broadly. And yeah, but it was within the Chamber of Commerce. And the Chamber of Commerce, they're the people who are going to be doing the badging systems. And, I went today to add this dot with it's called the Arts and Business Council, to add this into the map. And there's the director of the garden. She's the feature person here, in the image on the website. And, they're talking about in the Chamber of Commerce, an event coming up called the Digital Drawing Board, Gamifying Art, right? Because it's all going to be a game. And their tweets are all about, think like a game designer, right? And right, I keep saying that Kevin Werbach always says you want to be the game designer and make the rules, because the rules can change overnight and you might not ever know. This image, it's talking about this drawing, the digital drawing board. It says that it's working with leaders in the creative economy to give them the skills they need to enhance their digital presence and reimagine offerings for virtual engagement, right? Because they want to push it into Zoom, right? They want, like, no, you can't meet with me in person and talk about the commons. We have to meet on Zoom, so that all of it is captured for the machine. And this event was underwritten by the Knight Foundation. And I've been talking about, the Knight Foundation, that's money from the newspaper industry. I think originally Akron, Ohio, but now based in Miami. But Knight Foundation has been working with Niantic on augmented cities and this idea of playful augmented cities. And Niantic, they got their seed funding from In-Q-Tel, which is the venture capital arm of the CIA. So here's another pullout from the Knight Foundation in Philadelphia, working on civic engagement at our library with Pokemon Go. And they have, kids there being trained to do their civic engagement through the smart contract layer, and they're talking about the data strategy for the free library. Only the free library isn't free. You pay for it with your data. And, ultimately, so many of these libraries were funded by Carnegie. So as much as I love the library, you have to understand, like, what gets printed, what gets bought by the library, what gets made available, what gets put on the bestseller list, who are the authors coming. They're all part of the civilizing process to create this uniformity. And then we have Niantic. This is part of the Augmented Cities Fellows Project. And so the top one is from Philadelphia. Communities are hungry, starving even for fresh, positive ideas and initiatives, especially when youth are impacted, right? So these people, like, I even had a conversation with this particular person about, like, do you know what Niantic is? Do you know where their money comes from? Like, maybe you shouldn't be feeding the youth into the CIA's video game machine, right? It's talking about experiencing that today's technology can expose people to ideas, experiences, and community more efficiently than before. So efficient, right? It's these socio-technical systems of cyber-physical systems that we will have efficient experiences. That was from Macon. Here's one from Akron. That we could play a game and tell the history of the neighborhood. And they want the gaming, again, for the complexity modeling. This idea of social gaming is evolutionary and revolutionary. And that's from someone in Charlotte. These are all cities that got grants from Niantic to do their augmented culture. So when we do our culture in the web, it is going to feed the web. So here, I'm just going through. So I will also mention this. Somebody brought this up in a comment on one of my blog posts, and I found it quite interesting, actually. It's called I don't know how you pronounce it. It's ICEALITY. If it's isality, the theory of isality and creative placemaking and social change. And this was a movement that came out of in the late 1980s. So again, the same time as the Santa Fe Institute was coming on board. It was in Cleveland, which is Standard Oil and Rockefeller. And it's quite an oddball website, this ICA thing. It looks, if you scroll through it, it's a bit over the top. It's not the most professional website. The colors are very oddly put together. And it's talking about the International Center for the Environmental Arts and Creative Placemaking. It's very much connected to the United Nations, although, again, it's not a super slick website. So they talk about having all of these ties with the UN around peace and the Millennium Goals. Again, peace is homeostasis, and that this they were connected with something in Berea, Ohio. This Kunst. It's very iconic. I'm sure that people who know more about esoteric encoding would have a field day with some of this stuff. But the woman, it was David Jakupa, who is connected to the German-American business. But I believe that this idea of creative placemaking is also really central to social prescribing and the role of the arts. I've mentioned several times before about the opportunity zones. One of the people who wrote a chapter in Bitcoin to Burning Man, his name is Peter Hirschberg. I think I mentioned him the other day that he started out in Apple Enterprise, but he is currently the CEO of several capital development corporations that specifically are targeting opportunity zones. And so I believe that often arts and culture are like the transformative systems that are brought into neighborhoods that have often been intentionally wrecked and divested of, so that people can come in and like scoop up all the property for cheap and then make them over as sort of centers for arts and culture, that arts and culture on the vanguard. So again, not that I don't want creativity or like culturally rich neighborhoods, but it's all done under a certain heading of like placemaking. Again, I think Knight Foundation is connected to that. It sort of raises my eyes a little bit. So just to keep going along the social prescribing, let's see, Jill Sankey, she was an advocate. Again, they have their faces for these different programs. She's the research director at the Center for Arts and Medicine at the University of Florida, and she's into dance and communications. So, she's one of the salespeople for the social prescribing program. The University of Florida College of the Arts in Medicine, Transforming Health and Wellness Through the Arts. Use your creativity to advance health, wellness, and equity. So again, equity is really a huge piece of this, and especially because chronic illness is so much worse in Black and brown communities and poor communities because of the economic stress and the environmental toxins. People are often exposed to toxic environments, both socially and economically, and it actually directly environmentally. I've seen that at Bartram's, that they're going to be the targets for the wellness programs, the arts and wellness programs. So social prescribing, on this article that I showed you before with the British Council, it mentioned that in the social prescribing toolbox, that there was an evaluation of a social prescription pilot in Massachusetts. Again, it's not a surprise that Massachusetts would be a pilot for this because of both Harvard is central in the policy development and MIT is often central in the technology systems that will be tracking the data for the finance. Massachusetts had a program called a Cultural RX. So it was from the Mass Cultural Council. Here I have their homepage that's talking about the initiative of improving well-being through cultural participation. On the one hand, I have no problem with that. I'm not against that idea in as a premise, but I do think that it's the data that's going to be attached to it and the idea of putting people onto pathways for self-improvement that is going to be the problem. Here it's talking about the social ecological model of health. And again, social determinants of health is a phrase that you should look at very closely. They have a social prescription task force, and the Massachusetts group is working closely with the Florida group in the idea of creating healthy communities with an evidence-based framework in public health. So again, if you were to disconnect all of that from the smart contract, digital identity, cyber physical systems engineering, I would be okay with that. I think it's great that we should come up with some sort of system that actually does provide a robust, diverse set of cultural and artistic opportunities in all cities and all towns, and that compensates artists and educators and people who are in these spaces to so that they can also have a good life. I'm for all of those things, but let us not make it an impact opportunity. So what else does this look like? So Massachusetts, again, they're a center through the Harvard Kennedy School of a lot of the social impact policy. They're pay for success finance. They've done a lot of work in housing first. And just as she was saying, like, what if you present at the emergency room with anxiety and you have a health concierge prescribe you a pottery program? I think that this idea of assigned social workers, they're also going to be doing the social prescribing. So if you end up in a pay for success housing program, they're going to put a lot of different areas for self-improvement on the people who are getting those services. And so the fact that Massachusetts is also doing pay for success finance around housing. Once you get someone in the housing system, then you do have a certain measure of control over their behaviors, or you can pull them out of the housing. There's also the element, Massachusetts was an early pioneer in social emotional learning, and this idea of social emotional learning being financed through social impact bonds. So again, there are many people who often tend to be on the conservative side who are up in arms, like it's sort of like social emotional learning and critical race theory are the polarizing elements that are brought out to, in my opinion, they are the symptom of it. And I'm not being an apologist for how these programs are being delivered, but for the most part, the people who are talking about that with grave concern and talking about social engineering children in schools aren't realizing that it actually, whatever the engineering could be, the whole program could flip around and they could be engineering kids in the things that you want them to be engineered in. The issue is the engineering system, period. And that the fact that the cognitive engineering system is going to be tied to global financial markets is, in my mind, the bigger concern. So Massachusetts is a leader in the social emotional space, which again, this is being pushed through the United Way. I've talked about that yesterday or a day or so ago in the ALICE, the Assets Limited Income Constrained Poor. This is about managing the working poor as a social impact commodity. And so here's an image from the United Way in Massachusetts on social impact and training teen entrepreneurs for this. So again, you want to get the young people on board and thinking that this is the way to be in the world. And yeah, I just mentioned Alice. Here's just another image of United for Alice, that many partners. It's in, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's in like 25 different states. It's not in every state, but it's in about half of the states right now, the Alice programs. Those are going to be linked to pay for success and wellness. And ultimately, this benefits data trust that is linked to the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, which is the idea that there are benefit centers that connect people with social benefits. I'm not against the idea that people have access to the services that they need. My concern is that those are going to be tracked against compliance mechanisms on blockchain. And when you see that these large foundations, let me see who else is behind Benefits Data Trust. These very large foundations, who are the members? So it's like the United Way, I think Rockefeller, many of the health systems, many of the insurance providers. Yeah, Rockefeller Foundation, Chan Zuckerberg, Twilio, which is text messaging, the Gates Foundation, the New York Community Trust, Kresge, MasterCard. When you see all of these folks on there, they're on there because they want to get everybody on board with the data analytics. And so far that this is in North Carolina, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Colorado, and South Carolina. In Philadelphia, it's called Benephilly. And so you'll get people into the benefit systems, and then you can start to make the social prescriptions, right? Then you start to move into the tokenization. And eventually, I think it's going to feed into this idea of common fare, the social currency on the new form of welfare. And I forgot to mention somebody I was talking to after they listened to what I was saying about common fare, that they wanted to actually, in your social common coin wallet, to incentivize the sharing of each commoner, right? Because we're back to commons, right? The social impact commons. The commoners would share their stories, and largely these trauma stories of your struggles, into the AI, into the machine. This person reached out to me to mention something called story worth. And again, worth is related to value and money. That this gentleman by the name of Nick Baum, which is interesting, Baum I think is tree, that in 2012, he was formerly an employee of Google, and that he developed a product where you would buy a subscription, and every week a family member or someone would be emailed a prompt about their life history that they were supposed to respond to in email. And at the end of a year, those 52 email prompts would be turned into like an oral history book. So it was the story. And in some ways, to me, that feels like, again, it's all dual use, right? But this early premise of a file, it's not as granular as a mind file, but in some ways as the counterpoint of something that is more emotional. And this person described that, actually for them, even the first prompt, once they got into it, that it was really emotional to sort of go through the motions of answering it in a meaningful way, and that we're feeding all of this into Google. So again, we've got the tokens, the tokenized commons tied to your tokenized benefits, targeting people who are just trying to get by in this new era of automation. And, increasingly we have, right, there's a lot of housing insecurity, food insecurity, and that also really affects children in households where the families don't have a stable income. So in Massachusetts, there was an organization called Family Aid that was working with United Way to start doing childhood development assessments in homeless shelters, and doing working with the Boston Public Schools to essentially assess children who might be at risk of housing insecurity, and pulling in the teachers to do that. And this is part of this community school model, and it's linked directly to the social innovation. This is an image from one of these articles. It's sponsored by Aetna. It's a giveaway by Aetna, the insurance provider. It says, community-based organizations spotlight innovative social ventures sponsored by the United Way Venture Fund. So the United Way has this venture fund. This is from just September of 2022. It's pretty recent. And they're talking about the importance of data-driven partnerships during the pandemic, and linking that to food insecurity. And they mention here that, that teachers, that teachers are often the early warning signs for homelessness, and that they have a rapport. So they're using the teacher to get at the families, to get the data, and that all of these data analytics in I think the community schools model is being underwritten by this United Way venture fund, which to me, again, that puts the teachers in a really tough spot, because again, that's presuming that these social systems are actually set up to serve families as opposed to impact investors. And increasingly, I'm not sure that they are. So in that, Aetna was a partner in the program. And let's see. So in Aetna, I guess I'm trying to look, it was talking about like their history as a company going back to the 19th century, had issued life insurance policies on the lives of slaves. So there is this past history that fits into that level of insurance, right? And that's something that should be acknowledged and considered. Aetna was also involved in gaming for wellness. So they were working with something called Mind Bloom to have healthier, balanced living through social gaming and social games. And that's something that the Knight Foundation is very much connected to as well. Serious games and social gaming, because you can imagine the data sets that are created, and then they're all being linked to healthy living products. And so I would just keep saying, for the people who are in the alternative wellness spaces, this is really important. You are being set up for this social prescribing that's coming next. Is like you can be put on a leaderboard for good health behaviors and rewarded for all of that. So that's social gaming. Just going back to the social emotional learning and behavioral control systems, I do have a link in the map to the Clive Belfield study that came out of Columbia University that was in 2015 that essentially laid down the equation for like an 11% rate of return in behavioral management of children. It's called the economic value of social emotional learning. So in that report, it actually has that. 11% is a pretty solid rate of return in uncertain economic times. So this is the financial incentive for managed emotional wellness. So then this is sort of going back to my own personal experience again. Aetna has this mindfulness program. Here's an image for, it's called Class Act, How Mindfulness is Helping Transform Schools. And, it has these children with their eyes closed, sort of zoned out. Now, I would say a lot of the mindfulness stuff is also being linked to these biofeedback mechanisms, including like those Muse headbands. So that's coming, right? So these kids don't have the headbands on, but how does that work if we normalize mindfulness and then we add wearables and then we say, oh, by the way, Melanie Swan thinks it's great if maybe kids sell their unused brain cycles on the blockchain. So I'm very skeptical of a lot of the corporate mindfulness programming. And this is based on personal experience. So when I was working at the Garden, we actually had financial support from the Aetna Foundation, and it was for our farm, which was it's an amazing program. And actually, my colleagues that run that program, and it's working with youth in the Southwest Philadelphia area, and the intention is a healing program that connects young people to the soil and the regenerative process of like planting. And there's a lot of heirloom seeds and, seeds with like interesting cultural histories and African diaspora food. And then they have a farmer's market that's done every Thursday. And it's a great program. And so it was sponsored by this Cultivating Healthy Communities from the Aetna Foundation. And again, if you're running a nonprofit, you have to get money from somewhere to do these programs. But the same year that we had gotten this grant, we were doing, this is pre-lockdowns, we had outdoor movie nights, which were great. And we have this meadow and it has a skyline of the city in the back. And, they were free movie nights. They were family, like kid-oriented movies. But like that year, the most popular movie was Black Panther. And it was at the Garden. It was free. And, the lawn was covered. It was full because, especially for our audience. And I think if you look at that movie, understanding this idea of emerging technology, right? Like radical, like liberation, like women playing powerful roles, like girls in science and STEM. But then, a lot of people have done deconstructions of this too, right? Like with the CIA and, who's being uplifted in this thing. It's very, very targeted towards this new reality of like, hey, embrace your superpower and, and join with us to like make the world a better place. And so at this event, the Aetna came and they came with this RV, and you can see it's called Cora. And Cora is short for corazon, which in Spanish is heart. And, we've touched on this in the past, but the importance of love and the torus and the toroidal heart field, I don't think that that's coincidental. And so this was an RV that they took promoting children's health plans. And again, it's so hard to have this conversation because I want children to have access to affordable healthcare that fits their needs or their families, but increasingly it seems like the goal of a lot of managed health systems is like creating impact finance spaces and possibly moving us towards this post-human existence, wellness as an avatar kind of thing. And so this RV came. And it says it was a mobile health clinic, and it was specifically targeting the Latino community. Now, now the garden, the Southwest Philadelphia is predominantly African American, but so that was sort of the larger audience for our event. But it talks about like when you get in the RV, guests are greeted by a smoothie bar stocked with fresh fruit. So yes, we had the smoothies. To the right is a Wii setup for Dance Dance Revolution, Guitar Hero, and other interactive games. So we weren't really doing the gaming that night, but I did see the installation. And then it says towards the back is a sitting area with 4 pairs of virtual reality goggles. And so this is the one, like, I knew, this is in 2018, but I knew the problems with VR. And I'm like, no, like you even the goggles say, like, if you're under 13, you shouldn't actually put those on. Like there's a health hazard, like besides just like a general hygienic thing with like bunches of strangers putting on these goggles. And like, so that part wasn't at the event, but I remember talking with the woman who was like the host of the van, and she's like, I love my RV. I love it. It's like, it was kind of odd, like her attachment to this RV. And, you know, at the time, you know, she said that the virtual reality goggles were for meditation and that you could meditate in the jungle. And I was thinking, wow, okay, so if you match that with the social impact space, and, you know, I just want to go back for a second and talk about, you know, Leo has talked about, and I have talked about this guy, Jonathan Ledgard, and the interspecies currency, right? And so he actually, it turns out, Ledgard wrote, he is published with Brookings, this idea of emerging tech in Africa and interspecies currency. And so like here we have, this is an article featuring him in the New Yorker. And the interspecies currency premise and the mind cycle thing. And I'm just like, again, thinking back to my real lived experience, which was being in a meadow outside in Bartram's Garden, outside the county's oldest barn from the mid 19th century, with this purple RV. You know, the family's getting ready for this night, and we're promoting, you know, we weren't promoting it, but these hosts were promoting wellness with these smoothie bars and BMI measurements. And then saying, like, we weren't doing it that night, but that one of the activities was doing mindful meditation in the jungle, and thinking, like, that's connected. Like, I can't imagine but think that that is connected to an interspecies currency and this idea of, like, collectively entering into consciousness with other entities. And, you know, the podcast that Leo and I did around Curve Labs and these going into public parks and doing rituals with artifacts left by other people, which is, again, stigmergy, and how this is all fitting together as sort of a perverted digital ritual that's being reframed as arts and culture and wellness. It's I guess what I'm saying is it doesn't feel like it's far away. It feels like it's already here. It's just the future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. And so I'm getting sort of close to wrapping up, but there's a few things that I wanted to touch on just in closing for context. You know, I did that long presentation about linking the Epic Health Systems health portal. And again, you can imagine how all of the social prescribing would be fit into the health portal. But this idea of linking Huxley's vision from his the UNESCO charter, this from 1946, UNESCO, its purpose and its philosophy, into it. And there was a section specifically about the importance of the creative arts in this transformation, which he really did understand as an evolutionary transformation. And you know, he was connected with Teilhard de Chardin, and I'm sure it's what he wrote was very, very much in line with what Oliver Reiser wrote in World Sensorium. So they touch on many things. UNESCO, a focus is on education and the creative arts. And they're talking about that the ability of arts to represent values. And this is from the document. It says, let's see. Okay. In the arts, matters are quite different. Here we are within the realm of values. The individual work of art is preeminent, and no amount of quantity can offset low quality. And since each work of art, be it poem or play, painting or sculpture, symphony or ballet, is by its nature an individual creation, it can never simply be pooled with others. and accordingly, variety and multiplicity must always be encouraged. Thus, what UNESCO must here aim at is not at promotion of a single movement, but the orchestration of diversity. And again, that is sort of the order from chaos and the way in which complexity theory strives on diversity. And once I had that in my head a little bit more, that the goal of managed complexity is in the diversity, right, is in the identification of the agents of the team members. And that was what you would have on your ledger system. And then the organization of teaming. And I think the intentionality around temporary teams, that you have custom built teams that are brought together for single purpose and then disassembled and then reassembled with different members, and all of which that productivity would be tracked in a ledger-based system towards this emergence or convergence or consilience, like that. I feel like that's part of it, but that art is like, it feels like a concentrated communication, that art itself is probably more valuable than a lot of random information that's being put out, because it is a distillation of value and someone's sort of internal thought process, that in the world of tokenization, that the individual artifacts are probably have a lot of value in this space for that reason, for the idea of informing teaming and the products of those teams. So I'll just go on. This is again Huxley. I will only say this: the successful work of art always produces an emotional impact. Further, this impact has something almost physiological about it, certainly something irrational and intuitive in its nature. In addition to this basic unconsciously acting component, the true work of art always also provides a certain distillation of conscious experience. And so again, going back to understanding that this tokenized commons management by the Mellons, and that like Mary Mellon was interested in Jung and archetype and story, that the distillation of art as consciousness, and again, situating it within this 1966 meetup at the Worcester Institute, saying like, hey, like we know as mathematicians and physicists that this toolbox that we have isn't enough to explain neo-Darwinian evolution. There's got to be something else that is to be found like in faith and consciousness and internal proceedings, including art. So I think so. It's the distillation, and then it goes on to actually talk about, because the whole point of Huxley's UNESCO is that it's this one world government, it's this one world order, and they're talking about that nationalism is dangerous, and of course this is coming out of World War II, but their goal is really, ultimately is going to be the smart contract layer and HAL 9000, but that art provides an outlet for national feeling that can be legitimate and desirable, and that it is right and proper that every nation should be fully conscious and proud of its artistic achievement, so that we should transfer national rivalry from the plane of hostile physical competition into art and cultural achievements. And so it would sort of be a war of the arts rather than a war on the battlefield. So, and yeah. I mean, and this is just at the end, they're talking about the creative arts having a special role to play, music being very direct because it doesn't have the barrier of language, and the visual arts are the private imaginings of the artists, and that architecture gives concrete expression to the pride and function of community. Again, that's creative placemaking and urban design. Prose uses language to express ideas through the intellect, and poetry is more like painting to transmute brute facts into new forms and expressions that are nonetheless real and true for being imbued with a quality and magic. That drama gives immediacy and concreteness to conflict, whether of character or destiny or idea. So too does film, but with advantages in transcending time and space. And then in closing, it says that the rise of science and technology has led the modern world to lay undue emphasis on the intellect against emotion and on the material against spiritual, with the result that the arts are neglected, and that UNESCO will help sort of remedy that process. So again, what's coming is this this need for the arts and culture to tap into that vein and fill out the science. And that's sort of the consilience, is bringing the laws of natural science into the social sciences and the arts. And so, it's very interesting that this social prescribing would be framed within a health context. And I'll just mention that this person, who is the CFO of the Social Impact Commons Incubator, that her background before, so she worked for something called TSNE Mission Works, which is in the Boston area, which in and of itself started out in public health. She worked briefly for something called Pathfinder International, which is around, I think, reproductive health management, and spent 9 years in the management sciences for health. And this is all in Greater Boston. So she was coming out of the public health space. And even though she was only at Pathfinder International for like 9 months, according to her LinkedIn, that organization was working on reproductive health and was a partner in that program called Hello Mama, which was maternal health text messaging in Africa. And it was a program that was run through USAID and Johnson & Johnson and this J.H. Piego, which is a gynecology education program out of Johns Hopkins, and this Mobile Alliance for Maternal Health. And that, if you've seen my talks and read about my writings about the conditional cash transfer program in Mexico, there was a huge amount of effort, both again in the global South, around managing the birthing process, managing women and children, and doing that through these text app analyses, to tell them how to be a good parent, but also incidentally keeping people connected to devices and EMF radiation at the same time. So while it seems like somewhat of an odd connection, art and health, you can see why that if they need all of this information, why it's so important. So now I'm just going to close with some readings from, let me see. It's actually a book that this person I was acquainted with on social media. Paul brought my attention to it, and it's by James Carse. It's called Finite and Infinite Games, and I have the actual, I lost my copy and then I found it again, and I've got it here, I guess. Oh yeah, there, you can see it. It was written, I think, also in the 80s. Let me just, let's see. Yeah, 1986. So a lot of these things are happening right around the time I was graduating high school. And finite and infinite games. And it's this vision of life as play and possibility. And I'm going to go ahead and read this now because I do think that it informs the overall conversation sort of in closing. And I think it will prepare the way for the next conversation that Cliff and I are going to have that talks a little bit about fitness landscapes and gaming and navigating the labyrinth. Because I think the understanding the difference between a finite game and an infinite game and the mental space that each of those occupies is really helpful. So I'm just going to go through and read some of these sections. Now, the first time when Paul told me about it, I wasn't quite prepared. I started reading it, and then I got bogged down, and I set it aside, and then I didn't get back to it. And then I lost it, and then I ordered another copy. And so this time around, I'm about 50 pages in, but I think I have the mental framework to place it and hold it in a way that's more meaningful. And so it's all these little sections, and I'm just going to read. So the very first line of the book, it says, there are two kinds of games. And again, maybe I'll go over here. This is game theory. And I think the game theory, if we can imagine it as being like a core node of the game, is and the complexity is grounded in the Cold War, right? And in the nuclear arms race, and I guess, and also the game of evolution, right? They're using these genetic algorithms to turn life processes into gaming systems. That's what Cowan and the Santa Fe Institute were about, was using complexity theory to model evolutionary aspects of societies and individuals. So keep all of this in mind as we talk about the game as context. A finite game, okay, so there are at least two kinds of games. One could be called finite, and the other infinite. A finite game is played for the purpose of winning. An infinite game for the purpose of continuing the play. Now I'll just say that last line again. A finite game is played for the purpose of winning, an infinite game for the purpose of continuing the play. And so those are two very different purposes. Winning versus continuing. This is at the end of the second section. It says, there is no finite game unless the players freely choose to play it. No one can play who is forced to play. It is an invariable principle of all play, finite and infinite, that whoever plays, plays freely. Whoever must play, cannot play. And so this has a lot to do with the idea of choice and how we, the stories we inhabit and what we tell ourselves about it. And so I think that that's really important to keep in mind, that the games that we are playing, we choose to play. And if we feel like it wasn't our choice to play, we should maybe revisit the conditions under which we are playing, because we'll realize that we actually do have other options. Now, not that the consequences of making a different choice are not significant, but in the end, the games that we play, we choose to play, and that's really important. So it says that finite games can be played within an infinite game. So you can have smaller games, these fixed games in the infinite game. But an infinite game cannot be played within a finite game. So one encloses the other, but not the other way around. Infinite players regard their wins and losses in whatever finite games they play, but as moments in continuing play. So the finite game that is determined by a win, if people are playing the finite game alone, it's only about the win. But the people who understand these smaller games as being within a larger game that continues indefinitely, that those wins aren't really wins, they're just means to continue the game to the next stage. Okay. And so this is moving on to page 38. And I'm just going to read this straight through. It's about culture and society. And so I think with that understanding of like, if you must play, you can't play. Like if someone is totally forcing you, it's not a game. But we choose to play, and we can choose to play in the infinite or the finite. And then the finite itself is determined by wins and losses in relations to other and power dynamics. But the infinite is about simply moving the game into the next phase. And so keep all of this in mind if we understand social prescribing and game theory as complexity management and emergent consciousness. When Bismarck described politics as the art of the possible, he meant, of course, that the possible is to be found somewhere within fixed limits, within social realities. He plainly did not mean that the possible extended to those limits themselves. Such a politics is therefore seriousness itself, especially since politicians of nearly every ideology represent themselves as champions of freedom, doing what is necessary and even distasteful toward the end of enlarging the range of the possible. Quote, "We must learn the fine arts of war and independence so that our children can learn architecture and engineering, and so that their children may learn the fine arts and painting." John Quincy Adams. The interest of infinite players has little in common with such politics, since they are not concerned to find out how much freedom is available within the given realities, for this is freedom only in the trivial sense of playing at, but are concerned to show how freely we have decided to place these particular boundaries around our finite play. They remind us that political realities do not precede, but follow from, the essential fluidity of our humanness. This does not mean that infinite players are politically disengaged. It means rather that they are political without having a politics, a paradoxical position easily misinterpreted. To have a politics is to have a set of rules by which one attempts to reach a desired end. To be political, in the sense meant here, is to recast the rules in an attempt to eliminate all societal ends. That is, to maintain the essential fluidity of human association. To be political in the mode of infinite play is by no means to disregard the appalling conditions under which many human beings live, the elimination of which is the professed end of much politics. We can imagine infinite players nodding thoughtfully at Rousseau's famous declaration, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." They can see that the dream of freedom is universal, that wars are fought to win it, heroes die to protect it, and songs are written to commemorate its attainment. But in the infinite player's vision of political affairs, the element of intentionality and willfulness, so easily obscured in the exigencies of public crisis, stands out in clear relief. Therefore, even warfare and heroism are seen with their self-contradictions in full display. No nation can go to war until it has found another that can agree to the terms of the conflict. Each side must therefore be in complicity with the other. Before I can have an enemy, I must persuade another to recognize me as an enemy. I cannot be a hero unless I can first find someone who will threaten my life, or better, take my life. Once underway, warfare and acts of heroism have all the appearances of necessity, but that appearance is but a veil over which the often complicated maneuvers by which the antagonists have arranged their conflict with each other. Therefore, for infinite players, politics is a form of theatricality. It is the performance of roles before an audience, according to a script whose last scene is known in advance by the performers. The United States did not, for example, lose its war in Southeast Asia so much as lost its audience for a war. No doubt much of the disillusion and bitterness of its warriors comes from the missing final scene, the hero's homecoming to parades or ceremonial burial, an anticipated scene that carries many into battle. It is because of the essential theatricality of politics that infinite players do not take sides in political issues, at least not seriously. Instead, they enter into social conflict dramatically, attempting to offer a vision of continuity and open-endedness in place of the heroic final scene. In doing so, they must, at the very least, draw the attention of other political participants, not to what they feel they must do, but why they feel they must do it. In their own political engagements, infinite players make a distinction between society and culture. Society they understand as the sum of those relations that are under some form of public constraint. Culture as whatever we do with each other by undirected choice. If society is all that a people feels it must do, culture is, quote, the realm of the variable, free, not necessarily universal, of all that cannot lay claim to compulsive authority. Burckhardt. The infinite player's understanding of society is not to be confused with, say, natural instinct or any other form of involuntary activity. Society remains entirely within our free choice, is quite the same way that finite competition, however strenuous or costly to the player, never prevents the player from walking off the field of play. Society applies only to those areas of action which are believed to be necessary. Just as infinite play cannot be contained within finite play, culture cannot be authentic if held within the boundaries of society. Of course, it is often the strategy of a society to initiate and embrace a culture as exclusively its own. Culture so bounded may even be so lavishly subsidized and encouraged by society that it has the appearance of open-ended activity, but in fact, it is designed to serve societal interests in every case, like the socialist realism of Soviet art. Society and culture are therefore not true opponents of each other. Rather, society is a species of culture that persists in contradicting itself, a freely organized attempt to conceal the freedom of the organizers and the organized, an attempt to forget that we have willfully forgotten our decision to enter this or that contest and to continue in it. If we think of society as all that a people does under the veil of necessity, we must also think of it as a single finite game that includes any number of smaller games within its boundaries. A large society will consist of a wide variety of games, though all somehow connected, inasmuch as they have bearing on a final societal ranking. Schools are a species of finite play to the degree that they bestow ranked awards on those who win degrees from them. Those awards in turn qualify graduates for competition in still higher games, certain prestigious colleges, for example, and then certain professional schools beyond that, with a continuing sequence of higher schools, of higher games in each of the professions, and so forth. It is not uncommon for families to think of themselves as a competitive unit in a broader finite game for which they are training their members in the struggle for societally viable titles. Like a finite game, society is numerically, spatially, and temporally limited. Its citizenship is precisely defined, its boundaries are inviolable, and its past enshrined. The power of citizens in a society is determined by their ranking in games that have been played. A society preserves its memory of past winners. Its record-keeping functions are crucial to social order. Large bureaucracies grow out of the need to verify the numerous entitlements of the citizens of that society. The power of a society is determined by its victory over other societies in still larger finite games. Its most treasured memories are those of the heroes fallen in victorious battles with other societies. Heroes of lost battles are almost never memorialized. Foch has his monument, but not Pétain. Lincoln, but not Jefferson Davis. Lenin, but not Trotsky. The power in a society is guaranteed and enhanced by the power of a society. The prizes won by its citizens can be protected only if the society as a whole remains powerful in relation to other societies. Those who desire the permanence of their prizes will work to sustain the permanence of the whole. Patriotism in one or several of its many forms, chauvinism, racism, sexism, nationalism, regionalism, is an ingredient in all societal play. Because power is inherently patriotic, it is a characteristic of finite players to seek a growth of power in a society as a way of increasing the power of a society. It is in the interest of a society, therefore, to encourage competition within itself, to establish the largest number of prizes, for the holders of prizes will be those most likely to defend the society as a whole against its competitors. Culture, on the other hand, is an infinite game. Culture has no boundaries. Anyone can be a participant in a culture anywhere at any time. Because a society maintains careful temporal limits, it understands its past as destiny. That is, its course of history lies between a definitive beginning, the founders of society are always especially memorialized, and a definitive ending. The nature of its victory is repeatedly anticipated in official declarations, quote, to each according to their need, from each according to their ability, for example. Because culture as such can have no temporal limits, a culture understands its past not as destiny, but as history. That is, as a narrative that has begun, but points always towards the endlessly open. Culture is an enterprise of mortals, disdaining to protect themselves against surprise. Living in a strength of their vision, they eschew power and make joyous play of the boundaries. Society is a manifestation of power. It is theatrical, having an established script. Deviations from the script are evidence at once. Deviation is anti-societal and therefore forbidden by a society under a variety of sanctions. It is easy to see why deviancy is to be resisted. If persons did not adhere to the standing rules of society, any number of the rules would change, and some would be dropped altogether. And this would mean that past winners no longer warranted ceremonial recognition of their titles, and are therefore without power, like the Russian princes after the revolution. It is a highly valued function of society to prevent changes in the rules of the many games it embraces. Such procedures as academic accreditation, licensure of trades and professions, synodical ordination, parliamentary confirmation of its official appointments, and the inauguration of political leaders or acts of the larger society, allowing persons to compete in the finite games within it. Deviancy, however, is the very essence of culture. Whoever merely follows the script, merely repeating the past, is culturally impoverished. There are variations in the quality of deviation. Not all divergence from the past is culturally significant. Any attempt to vary the past in such a way as to cut the past off, causing it to be forgotten, has little cultural importance. Great significance attaches to those variations that bring the tradition into view in a new way, allowing the familiar to be seen as unfamiliar, as requiring a new appraisal of all that we have been and therefore of all that we are. Cultural deviation does not return us to the past, but continues what was begun and not finished in the past. Societal convention, on the other hand, requires that a completed past be repeated in the future. Society has all the seriousness of immortal necessity. Culture resounds with the laughter of unexpected possibility. Society is abstract and culture concrete. Finite games can be played again. They can be played an indefinite number of times. It is true that the winners of a game are always the winner of a game played at that particular time, but the validity of their titles depends on the repeatability of the game. We memorialize early football greats, but we would not do so if football had vanished after its first decade. As we have seen, because an infinite game cannot be brought to an end, it cannot be repeated. Unrepeatability is a characteristic of culture everywhere. Mozart's Jupiter Symphony cannot be composed again, nor could Rembrandt's self-portraits be painted twice. Society preserves these works as prizes of those who have triumphed in their respective games. Culture, however, does not consider the works as the outcome of a struggle, but as moments in an ongoing struggle, the very struggle that culture is. Culture continues what Mozart and Rembrandt had themselves continued by way of their work, an original or deviant shaping of tradition, the tradition they received. Original enough that it does not invite duplication of itself by others, but invites the originality of others in response. Just as an infinite game has rules, a culture has tradition. Since the rules of play in an infinite game are freely agreed to and freely altered, a cultural tradition is both adopted and transformed in its adoption. Properly speaking, a culture does not have a tradition. It is a tradition. So I'm just, all right. So that's in closing. I don't know if you guys in the chat have any thoughts on that. I know it's a lot to absorb, but I think that the way through the labyrinth is in the infinite game, right? And maybe in the deviant culture and the playfulness, and you can imagine, sort of in what I've talked about the ledger of record and the Monte Carlo algorithms and the genetic algorithms and the way in which culture is intending to be prescribed as a public health metric. That all of those things are all the finite game, right? The preserving the entitlements, the title, the power, like that is what the ledger is about. The ledger is about the finite, right, of maintaining and holding on to the history such that it can't be changed by the future. And I feel like it's the infinite approach that might hold a lot of possibility for us. And, I say this as someone who tends to be rather slogging through lots of facts, and I'm not the most playful person in the room. I'm not the most creative person in the room. That's not like my gift, but I can appreciate that in others. And I think that playfulness and that idea that the future is not the past and that there's merit in being surprised and being surprising is something that we should spend more time thinking about. So anyway, I appreciate you joining in with me this afternoon from the kitchen in the spirit of playfulness and examination. And again, I guess I will just close by saying, going back to the original starting point to close out this part of the labyrinth that we were talking about today was sort of compliments of Thaddeus Squire of the Social Impact Commons and the fact that in his new normal, the Commons is something that we meet about to talk about on Zoom, except unless the person in your appointment book is me, and then you say, no, thank you. Good luck with that, feeding AI and the art and culture into the AI system, right? But maybe this will make its way back to him. I'm not trying to make Thaddeus wrong. He's occupying a certain place in the labyrinth. He's the front man for the DAO fiscal sponsorship that's going to legitimize arts and culture access bringing them to scale in the probably some sort of cooperative token economy for the public good, so that the ledger can get all of its data for the complexity engineering, so that we have like a really robust and resilient global world superorganism of which we are all reduced to being cellular components. So thank you, Thaddeus, for this opportunity to talk again about social prescribing and reflect on my own direct experience with Cora, the purple RV at Bartram's Garden, at the Black Panther movie night, and finding out, shocker, about the mindfulness meditation of the children in VR headsets in its potential application in terms of interspecies currency. Anyway, thanks everybody. Till next time.